Then we are ready for our conversation with our two guests, Avery Gordon and Anselm Franke. A very warm welcome. My name is Yasmin Nadari Afshar. I'm one of the co-directors of the Migros Museum, and my welcome is also on behalf of the large curatorial team of this project. That's Marco Scottini, the guest curator and initiator of the Disobedience Archive. It's Nadia Schneider-Willen, who is also here tonight, Tasnim Baghdadi, Paula Tomaka, Mirta Gionaka, and Alessia Riva, some names of the many who worked on that. And we are all very happy to have this conversation because it feels like Avery Gordon, or like your work, is pretty much a perfect fit when it comes to the Disobedience Archive. So we were excited to see or realize that you are right now in Zurich and teaching a workshop at the ZHDK on the invitation of Anselm Franke. So we reached out, and it was, let's say, at least for museum standards, quite short notice. So I'm very happy that this all came together, and we are here tonight and have you two in the exhibition. And also for me personally, the two of you have a connection. I already told Avery, so I got you to know your work through an artist friend, Denis Berci. Many years ago, we worked together on an exhibition and a publication where Anselm contributed to, so also this kind of the whole project was somehow linked to the work of the two of you. I guess many of the people in the audience know the two of you, but I still will do a quick introduction. Avery Gordon was a professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara for 30 years, and now is a visiting professor at Birkbeck School of Law, University of London, also since more than 10 years. She is, as we know, the author of many important books, amongst others, the Hawthorne Archive, Letters from the Utopian Margins from 2018, and Ghostly Matters, Haunting and the Sociological Imagination from 1997. Avery's work focuses on radical thought and practice. She writes about captivity, enslavement, war, and other forms of dispossession, and how to eliminate them. She served on the editorial committee of the journal Race and Class, and was the co-host of No Alibis, which I find very interesting, weekly public affairs radio program on KCSB FM Santa Barbara, from 1997 to 2023, which is a very long time of doing radio. And every Wednesday morning from 8 to 10. Wow. So I found that really impressive. And she's an active member of the Hawthorne Archive. We're going to talk about that later, and was its keeper for many years. Anselm Maria Franke is professor for cultural critique and curatorial studies at ZHDK Zurich. He has curated major projects including Animism, a also 4 years project, 2010 to 2014, co-organized more recently the symposium Der große Kanton, Rise and Fall of the BRD in Zurich, which got a lot of attention, and he served as the head of visual arts and film at the Haus der Kultur und der Welt in Berlin from 2012 to 2023. Anselm's work focuses on political, cultural, and archival practices within contemporary art. And before we're going to talk more about that perfect match, I suggest that we start with a brief sense of where you are at the moment, or a brief check-in. So you're coming out of, if I understand now, 3 days of a seminar at the ZHDK. It's also not your first collaboration. Many of some of the students are here tonight, and the seminar or the class was here already yesterday, and we spent some time together in the exhibition. And the title of the seminar is Haunted Histories, Assemblage Methodology. And I think it would be nice as a start also to share with us from what kind of context we are taking you out this evening. And I think it's a question for the two of you, maybe.
Just thank you, Jasmine, and thank you very much for inviting us. It's really nice to be here. This is really, I am really like a guest in Anselm's course, so that's what I'm doing. I'm kind of being a guest, and he can describe more what the program is, the MA in Curatorial Practice, but what we were trying to do in at least a few days this week was take up questions around methodology in particular, and to think about this question of haunted histories from a methodological point of view. So particularly the students in the program are studying curatorial practice. This is not my profession, so I'm coming at that question from a different angle. And so we just try to organize it less around theoretical question and more around our respective practice. Because when you talk about methodology, you're talking about what is your mode of production, knowledge production, exhibition production, etc. And there's something about removing it too far away from the practical work that I think loses some focus. So I talked a bit about my practice on Tuesday, the books that you mentioned, and also the book I'm writing now, which is about a soldier rebellion that took place in South Korea in 1948, and the legacies of that around 1948. So this is another subject, but that's something that I'm working on now. We watched 3 parts of Wang Tuo's Northeast Tetralogy about Northeast China, sort of a major, I think, artistic example of dealing with haunted histories in a different context. Anselm led on Wednesday and took up the question of animism as a political, social, artistic problem and the problem of division in the categorical. And then we came and spent a very lovely, gracious afternoon with you. And then this morning we talked about our visit here on Wednesday. That's what we talked about this morning, in part. And we talked about Foucault this morning. And again, division and the ways in which subjects of knowledge are produced and created, and how we think about that.
Yeah, also my heartfelt thanks for the invitation. And maybe for now, what I could add to this is I also sort of tried to just really briefly narrate in the seminar, yesterday, how something like the work of Avery has been formative for the making of a number of projects, of curatorial projects, and this whole relationship between curatorial practice and historiography and history of ideas. And in fact, we go way back. Like I've read Avery in 2003, and then went to visit her in Paris, and then we started a long collaboration that was sometimes more intense, and then but also a lot of different things sort of came from it, like other collaborations that Avery has entered, and same on my side. So, for instance, we looked at the pages in Avery's book Ghostly Matters, which is quite a book that quite a lot of people somehow stumble upon and again, I think today, right? Like it had its life already, and this kind of has come back into the discussion in many ways. And what's been really crucial for me, I mean, I could say, like, you know, this animism project that you mentioned, which was a traveling exhibition with many different chapters, started in Antwerp, Bern, Vienna, Berlin, Seoul, Shenzhen, Beirut, New York, etc. That the sort of the push to think, yeah, that is a project that I could do. Really, I owe to Avery. I owe to these pages in Avery's book, where she discusses what this concept did in the history of psychoanalysis, and where she discusses somehow what Freud opens up through this project, namely a possible social unconsciousness, the key concept obviously of psychoanalysis being the unconscious, and then how he forecloses it at the same time, how he shuts the doors of that conception, of a political and social conception of the unconsciousness, of the unconscious, in order to institute, really, to institutionalize the idea of what we should refer to as the bourgeois conception of the psyche, as the kind of container that is, formed at birth, and then a lot of mama papa stuff gets stuffed into it, and that's what you deal with on the couch, which is obviously very different from the kind of haunted histories that, say, if Avery now writes a book about a soldier's rebellion, that is a very different sort of political unconscious that we're dealing with. So maybe that's, as a start, anecdotal, but acknowledging the formative role that a text can have, that then a conversation that ensued from that over many years had on just one project, really, but there are many more.
Yeah, I mean, it is another way to think about what an assemblage methodology is. So it's not just where you're assembling different items or different ways of acquiring knowledge. In the social science, we call that multi-methodological, meaning you do more than one thing. But this other set of relationships that Anselm is describing, which have also been very formative and important for me, and ways that my work opened up quite a bit through those encounters. It's not just one way where I'm doing the influencing at all. That would be unfair to conclude that. So, yeah.
And I think I can just pick on that, and because we were actually talking about ghostly matters, we were coming back to that also in discussion for this exhibition. The book is here in the reader, or the selection of books we put together. And it is also one, like there are many, and I hope to mention or discuss some of those potential connection points also between your questions and what the Disobedience Archive is about. And I think these that focus on modern forms of dispossession, exploitation, and repression, but not in a abstract or also purely theoretical way, but in terms of their actual impact on the people most affected by them, so also changing the perspectives, and on the conditions we live in. And I think that was something that we came back to. And then I think it would be very interesting also to talk about the Hawthorne Archive. I think that you initiated that brings together histories and practices of those who have challenged racial capitalism, but whose contributions were often obscured and misunderstood. And so the starting point, I guess, is the very word of the archive and archiving, and we were talking about that also yesterday in the group. Disobedience Archive might have archive in the title, but it really does a lot to push against the label. Its content is constantly changing. The archive has no fixed place, no stable structure. And a bit in a similar way, Hawthorne Archive not only has no location, but as you write, it's deliberately disorganized, difficult to access, and perhaps better understood as a way of living than as an archive in the conventional sense. So I would be interested in hearing more about your work with that project, and also how you would describe yourself maybe as an archivist.
Okay, let's see what to say about that. I definitely would not describe myself as an archivist. I've had very amusing interactions with actual radical archival folks. I went to a conference in Chicago with Black radical librarians, and they were like, so where is it? What are your hours? What's your access policy? I said, we don't have an access policy. There are no hours. And they were like, that's not good. We spent, we really were like completely very much working at cross purposes, although in many ways in a very similar purpose, but in a different way. I mean, one thing to say about the Hawthorne Archive is that it's a real, I like to say, it's like a real place and an imaginary one. And so that is to say, it's a place that exists in a book and also a place that exists outside of a book. For me, this makes it hard to talk about because you need to be constantly moving, in effect, between being inside of its world and being outside of its world and wanting in some ways to answer your questions genuinely, but at the same time keep the elements of the fabulation going with it. In other words, so this is I think difficult. So let me I'll mostly step out of it to answer this, and then there'll be moments when I kind of come back into it. You could say that the project, in the most simple sense, is about what haunts the conventional archive of the utopian, and how to give that voice and shape on its own terms. So that's the crucial thing, on its own terms, not on some other terms. And what I mean by the conventional utopian is that kind of perfect, no place, imagined as a little white nation. Almost the caricature of it. When I started this project, I was really wanting to know how we might think about the utopian differently if we conceived of, for example, slavery abolition, prison abolition as examples of it. And that sort of started a project that was prompted also by the historical moment in which it arose. And in that historical moment, there were other prompts. One having to do with a convergence of both left, so we're talking about in the 90s now, left and right discourse, seeing in both instances, but for different reasons, a closing of the political universe. So on the left side, 1968 is over. There's no capacity to think in broad political terms anymore. Everybody is just thinking about identity. That was the critique. On the right-hand side, it was basically life is great. Globalization, it's its own utopia. We don't need the critique, I mean, to put it very, very simply. And that both those claims seemed incredibly wrong to me and also really out of touch with what was a remarkable insurgency of popular movements around the world. That for me, I really signal in 1994 with the first letter that comes out from the Lacandon jungle by the Zapatistas, partially because it was very influential for me, but also because it's what makes legible the big WTO protests in Seattle that we think begins the anti-globalization or the anti-globalization movement. And so this is one set of prompts that's swirling to this. The other had to do with, for me, a question that I felt, wanting to pick up, you could say, where Ghostly Matters left off, which was, precisely with what Herbert Marcuse called the historical alternatives that haunt a given society as subversive tendencies. So to kind of think about that as something that Ghostly Matters ended on this note, and how to pick that up and to think about what it might mean to take that seriously as a kind of utopian space, or what I later called, following Bloch, the utopian margins. And so this was generally speaking, a project that started along kind of normative academic tracks and then radically braked on that and went in a different direction. And partially it went in a different direction. We could just blame Anselm on that. which I'm not going to blame him, but in many ways it was in part a whole series of things that moved me further and further away from wanting to do that work in a more academic format and wanting to find a different way of doing that. And that way was coming out of working with artists on shared projects where we were collaborating in one way or another and taking up a variety of questions. And it was in that context, in many ways, that the form of the archive emerged. Okay, so that's the outside the archive story. The inside of the archive story is a completely different story. You know, the archive is very, very, very old. And I am one of a long, line of keepers. And it is not a place or a book or a library or a collection or anything like that. It's a mode of living in a set of relationships that involve all kinds of things. Sometimes collecting things, sometimes producing knowledge, sometimes organizing various kinds of struggles, sometimes offering systems of refuge, a whole series of things that are more like way of life as opposed to a collection of works or ideas in that sense. And the complicated question of why it is done in the form of the archive is really, that's like a long answer to that in a way, so I don't want to take up too much time. But on the one hand, it's wrong to call it an archive because it isn't an archive. And even the question of why it's, anyway, there's a story about that, but it's on the one hand, it's poorly named as such. On the other hand, it's an easy kind of shorthand, and you could say it functioned as a kind of fugitive name for something that needed to hide behind something legible. And so it called itself not just archive, but the Hawthorne Archive. And the naming of it after that tree, first of all, people in the archive want to know, well, who did that and why? So this tree has an interesting folklore attached to it. It's the tree of witches and Mayday protesters, and has all kinds of famous medicinal properties attached to it. But in any event, the book itself tries to use the archive format to bring you into this world. And it does that in part to give life to the fiction that is the name, and at the same time also to bring you into a different kind of temporality in which what's past, what's present, what's future, what's here, what's there, what's real, what's not, is very played with. The borders are played with. And in that sense, it takes that artifice and it tries to use it to create a way of conjuring a world, but while keeping the question of is that world real or not, and where is it, and so on, still up in question. It's very hard to describe if you haven't seen it. I'm sorry, I'm very bad at talking about it.
No, maybe you could allow me to try to...
Yes, yes.
No, like just trying to sort of contextualize it within... so, for instance, like, I think one of the remarkable things about Avery's work, and sort of like 25 years ago, more or less, was really the way in which she's built or brought together different genealogies of anti-capitalist thought, different struggles that didn't figure for reasons that would lead too far or are more belonging perhaps to the seminar room in the mainstream left historiographies also, and the black radical tradition. And that wasn't something that a lot of people did at that time yet. And this very much comes out of, and like thinking, say, Herbert Marcuse and the abolitionist movement together. And I would say that the Hawthorne Archive and the other work of Avery really sits, broadly speaking, right? Like Ghostly Matters also, like say, Trouillot's book Silencing History is when? Early 90s? So say, just to, like an important book that somehow changes the discourse about, certain forms of social organization and their normativity, their claim to normative discourse are based on silencing, are based on foreclosing, rendering unspeakable histories that have resisted the normative core of certain form of, like for instance the claim that bourgeois revolutions constitute a genuine step forward to freedoms that were unavailable to pre-modern forms of existence, right? Which is now a lot of good history has been written on how false that is. I mean, not only false, it almost amounts to a form of social contract around a collective lie. And I think I want to really stress that point, because this is what we're experiencing now with the right wing, right? Like there's also even a jouissance in the collective lie that comes to perfect blossom in fascism, right? Like you want the social bond to cohere around exclusionary forms of violence that embrace a collective lie, right? Like say the supremacy of a certain group of people. Like this, and I think really important to understand this larger historiographic struggle, right? Like so for instance, say Marcus Rediker's work, right? Like is a lot of communication between what he's been doing, or the very intimate conversation over many years that Avery had with Cedric Robinson, who's done that basically for Marxism in the book Black Marxism and Anthropology of Marxism, by claiming very importantly that somehow the modernism of the discourse of Marxism and the whole idea of the sequential production, stages of production, would basically erase from history a huge amount of socialisms, right? That become illegible to us. Now, I think that's of major importance for museum work, right? Like, because if anything we believe in museums, it's that they somehow make the past legible in ways that breaks open the normative core and the closure of like the illegibility of outside our sort of, whatever I would right now I would prefer to call that sort of our food chain bubbles in the global in the world systemic chains of supply chains. Like how economic discourse really determines consciousness to an extent, and at the same time to resist a determinism that is also very much a Marxist legacy, right? Within that. So for my own curatorial work, like the early stages of collaborating with Avery, and I think that matters to this discourse here in the Disobedience Archive, like when I started doing exhibitions that would combine activist work with artistic work, with architectural research, territorial research, so like I would say that ever since that, like my first exhibition with Eyal Weizmann was in 2003, and that was part of our, or then this right after that, a big exhibition with Angela Melitopoulos and Ursula Biemann. Both works, or some of the work is here in this exhibition as well, where basically a sort of an artistic practice really becomes also an investigative practice, right? Like an like good investigative journalism on the one side, but also a form of artistic intervention within social and political consciousness, right? So now that's of course always a question, right? Like where do you draw the line? Do we need to draw a line? What does it mean to do investigative work in museum spaces? So for instance, when I was very much part of the whole development of forensic architecture, which somehow then, we were struggling with these questions of, it can't be only in the museum, right? Like it has to be all, like it has to respond to different systemic, like Eyal then came up with this idea of the forum. No? One public forum is culture, is art. One is the media, and one is the courtroom. So every investigation has to somehow have a currency in all three. But in the investigative side of work, right? Like what you don't have is somehow almost like the analysis of the political unconscious and the mythography. Like how does myth and the imaginary participate in consolidating or in breaking political imaginaries, right? Like, so I think of these as very much two different sides, and I think very much when we speak about the work, for instance, that you're doing right now, the haunted history of basically a post-slavery society in Korea, all of East Asia very much through mostly the anti-communism of the post-war era. There's full with this, like spectral histories that just don't go away, right? Like that go right through individual lives and determine very much global politics as well, that you would have to somehow find a way and a methodology to address both, right? Like the precision of evidence construction and the mythographic analysis that cannot be boiled down to evidence and fact. Right? Because it's also a question of how it lives in the subject. Maybe as an attempt to create a broader context for this work as well.
Yeah, that's really helpful and also a really interesting way to formulate it. I mean, I think that you're just taking me back to like my student days, and being in seminars with people like Fred Jameson, who were promoting and applying a very orthodox form of Marxism to cultural things, primarily literature, but not eventually he would move beyond that. And we have these terrible arguments about the incapacity to think that the intellectual operation needed to have and to recognize its own imbrication in the aesthetic practices that he was applying the theory to. And he never budged on this, ever. We just, the students, or the other students, not just me, we just always would fight on this question. And my intuition when I wrote Ghostly Matters was that that it wasn't just the social sciences that needed a less bloodless categories and languages and forms of analysis that could deal better with the fragile division that also then defined the disciplines between what is a fact and what is a fiction, what is a subject and what is an object, what is present and what is absent. And the constant fungibility of those boundaries and categories were, of course, exactly what disciplines were designed to manage and to administrate, and in the social sciences in particular, very firm borders here. And my sense was the minute that you start talking about what's invisible, what's missing, what's excluded, the question is, then what? So there were lots of mechanisms, and all the left Marxist academics were very good at this, for understanding systematic forms of exclusion in the way that systems of power produced these. The analysis was fine. But what they couldn't do was at least two things. One was to really dig deep into what you're calling, in effect, the psychosocial, the cosmological, the level of consciousness in which this appears, is embedded in the lives of people, whether they're harmed or revolting, or it doesn't matter, the mix. And so one thing for me was trying to find some way of working that intersection. We would say in the social science systems person, that arts would have a different language for it. And I had another thought, but I just lost it for the moment, what the other thing was, but it'll come back to me.
And I think, again, to bring this conversation also to the exhibition, I think there are many points now to do a connection, but maybe just because you were now speaking about what you did with looking at literature and the concepts of haunting in literature in comparison to social sciences and sociology, I would be interested in, because now having here these an archive with moving image, with film, with films done by very, very different artists, activists, filmmakers, practitioners that are active in the world of cinema, but then also in political world. So also very much in between things, what Anselm was also referring to, with that very time that was actually also the moment where Marco Scottini initiated the Disobedience Archive 20 years ago. So yeah, I think like aiming at similar goals, I would be interested in how what you think about the medium this archive is based on, the moving image, and also its potential, but also its problems, maybe. I think that's a question for both of you, I think, to comment on.
You want me to go first? Okay. I remember the other point I wanted to make.
Please.
That in response to what Anselm was saying, which was very helpful to remind me that the other goal was to do something that actually maybe gets to the question of film. I don't know, but it was not just to say something is missing, something is excluded, but to actually say, what is in the place hidden from view? This was my desire, still is always, to say, well, what's there? There's always something there. So what is it? How do you represent, how do you understand it? How do you represent it? What is it? Without simply acting as if it wasn't excluded or missing. That's I think, the operation. And Cedric Robinson, who was my colleague and friend for many years until he passed away when I was at Santa Barbara, was someone who I really was encouraged in this, because this was always Cedric's operation. And this was the whole, not just the question of the anthropology of Marxism, which was in many ways the second book in the trilogy that Black Marxism started. But the whole point of Black Marxism was to say there was something there. And it was not seen, and therefore it did not become something that needed theoretical justification by Marx and Marxisms. And that's what he called the Black radical tradition. And he had his own genealogy and historiography of it, which he took back, blah, blah, blah. We don't need to tell that whole story. But it was all about getting inside of that. And it was the same point he made in the anthropology of Marxism, which was Marx and Engels could have seen a history of socialism and socialist aspiration that actually preceded the development of capitalism, and had they done so, they might have had a different understanding of what that socialist impulse is, and blah, 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 blah. So that move is harder, I would say, than just saying something's missing. Either I tell you that something's missing, or I completely make it up what's there, according to my own rules and logics or literary genres or whatever. And so, I mean, that's the other thing I wanted to say that I had forgotten. I think you should start with film. I actually, when you mentioned that you wanted to talk about the question of film, I realized that for someone who, I mean, I watch endless amounts of cinema and video, and I've seen many things in this collection too that I have no interest in things to say about the genre, as the medium as a whole, other than I have something I would describe as cinematic desire running through with me, because I see it as a great conjuring medium. It's like an incredible medium of conjuring. And if you're someone who works with words, then you see what extraordinary help it is to not have to say one word, but just show you something that's still maybe even moving, and no words are required. And so like I always said, there's just something in me, a kind of cinematic desire. I've written a lot about the photograph in Ghostly Matters and other places and that, but, and one of the things about the new book that I'm writing is that I have kind of conceived it as an unmade film. So like a kind of, like the way you would make a storybook for film. And it's like, how do you make an unmade film on the flat page? And we were talking about Vincent Meeson earlier, who's a friend of mine. I was describing this problem to him, and he said, oh, that's great. You'll have a book, there will be no images. I was like, no, the whole point is the image. He said, no, you can't then have the images in the book. So anyway, we're still working on that. But the main thing that I see for me, because it has more to do with how I relate to it, and that is, if the cinematic form is a call, how do you respond to it? So what is the call and response relationship to it? So how do you develop a particular interpretive relation to an image or a set of images or a story and so on, in which I think, for me, my desire, at least in my own work, is to respond not necessarily in kind. So this is why Vincent says you may not have any images, but somehow in kindred, to use, if you like, Octavia Butler's term. Like, what would it mean to maybe respond in kindred rather than kind? So then the question always with so many films like this is, what is the structure by which it calls and you respond? And that's a whole other topic about how it's organized and what's here and what isn't and all that. But Anselm, please. Because Anselm has more interesting things to say about the cinematic than I do, I think.
Oh, dear. So, I mean, there's this slightly famous Benjamin quote, sorry for this. No, like, in cinema, people who have unlearned how to cry learned how to cry again. Or in cinema, people who have experienced fundamental alienation of the senses and of humanity learn how to cry again. So it's like, I think, in the One-Way Street book. So I don't know if that may, how did you call it? The desire, the cinematic?
The cinematic desire.
Yeah. And of course, there is this fundamental promise in cinematic, basically the cinematic illusion of movement that somehow responds to, so what Avery earlier said, no, like something is missing and something is there in the absence, and you have to learn how to listen to it, how to do both somehow the investigative, almost philological detective work, right? Like the chain of evidence to, say, for instance, an originating violence, right? The colonial frontier, for instance, or the bourgeois drama at home. And then there is this beautiful call in the Ghostly Matters book, which is to say, the ghost actually has a demand, and it's a demand for transformation. Right? And I see somehow that the cinematic desire and the transformative power that is, at least, and I'm not sure right now how really I think about that, is alluded to in the cinematic, has a relationship to that, right? Like, but then what is its effect in real world context? And anyway, we're living in surrounded so much by this kind of, you know, animated screens that I would probably take a very critical position towards that right now and not charge the cinematic like Benjamin did with his revolutionary powers, which may be just another illusion in the sense that, yes, cinema certainly is the most communist of all medias because people sit there hypnotized by the light beams and the flickering images and think and are actually certain that they perceive the same thing. That's the most communist thing, because actually we do not see the same thing in everyday life. We do not perceive the same things. So there is a trance of experiencing, of observing, of perceiving the same thing. Right? Like, and that's very much part of the cinematic dream in the 20th century. Does that still hold? I doubt it, right? Like, it's not, it's crumbling. Right? Yeah. But, you know, like we don't perceive the same thing for many different reasons. And like one way of approaching that, and my friend Erhard Schüttpelz has written wonderfully about that, has to do also with certain things that were really figured out in the sociological discipline, such as there is things, and this is of course also in museums, there is things like professional vision. There's a film of Harun Farocki here. Harun Farocki, in his later work, was very much interested in how, you know, for instance, people who do advertisement or people who do design a chair, that basically there's a point in many Harun Farocki films where you understand that now you are no longer seeing what the people he's following see. Right? Like there's, okay, you see how a Playboy ad is made, right? Or a beer advertisement. And there's a certain point when the image is almost ready and they compare, the ad people compare these images and they see things and you don't see them anymore. And that's the breaking point, really. So of course, an art expert sees lots of things that a sort of so-called general audience doesn't see, and this is like, or I wouldn't like someone, you know, before everything went down to silicon chips, someone would open, in a car shop, someone would open the engine and see immediately what's wrong, while I wouldn't see anything. Right? So there is really this ecstatic promise of it, and I think a lot of the films here are also made by people who are deeply suspicious of the luring part, or that was very much the mass media discourse also, like the Baudrillardian discourse, etc. Like a lot of these come from a deep tradition of media critique and culture industry critique. Right? And this is something that one should have in mind here. I mean, I would say this archive is an insane resource for political conscious raising. So one should do conscious raising workshops in this archive. If I said that yesterday, like if somehow you are in need of gaining a political consciousness, that's great stuff here, right? Like a really important work. There's a whole other dimension on how the aesthetic choices that are made and the practices, how they're situating themselves within or vis-a-vis these struggles, that's a whole other dimension. I guess when you're asking, Yasmin, like to sort of also bring this into the present, no? Like I think, then we obviously have to ask a lot of questions, right? Like somehow the current moment, you say in the early 2000s, you could, very clear-minded people could see that something about the promise, for instance, of the West making up for its historical crimes that would still be somehow a concept, like at least in something like Goethe Institute funding, right? Like we fund all these like very critical practices around the world, and there's a project of reckoning with past crimes, and that went into all the way into even the rehang of MoMA, and like, you know, righting the wrongs of the past also by basically making up for past constitutive exclusions by, now we are including, right? Like now we are inclusive. But our moment is one of you know, like if immigration offices issue rejection notices, the West is more or less, has been in the last 5 years issued a universal rejection notice, finished with the becoming good again, or if you know what I mean, right? Like, so what does that, like basically the context, the insanity of how the historiographic consciousness, like, you know, like I mean, you mentioned this conference that we did in December here, like, in a way you could say that the German memory culture paradigm, no, like of working through history, which is also like a, you know, a psychoanalytic term, right? Like dealing with the ghosts and doing that work, etc., has basically fundamentally collapsed, because if anything, it's meant to somehow immunize you against fascism, and that's obviously not the case, right? So there's a huge failures and abyssal. Like the certainty by which we can look at this as inscribed into a progressive history, I think is the ground on which such certainty might be articulated is fundamentally broken right now. So that's like raising a lot of questions for me now. Like what? But maybe I can pick up more on that later.
Thank you. And I think there is like one last question that is also kind of referring to things that were mentioned several times, and that's really like what are the, I mean, like the cinematic perspective, in what context we are watching these material, we are seeing the material, but then also the context. And we were talking in the very beginning, I think, what happens with activist action that comes into the institution and vice versa. And I think that would be for me like one last topic, because we have many of these moments here in the archive. Obviously also we have actions from the street coming into a film and via the archive into the exhibition space. We also have on a very different level, but still we have the shamianas, where the reference is clearly public space. It's a temporary architecture in South Asia, common in South Asia, that is providing shelter, but it's also a place to meet, to eat, to protest, to mourn, to celebrate, and so on. So we have these kind of elements coming from the public space into the museum, but then again we also have, let's say, artistic work that is here, and there was just the example of forensic architecture, but also other artists who are active also, but simply said, in the street. So what do we do with that? So I think it's a very, like I guess a question. I don't know if there is a clear answer about it, and we are here now sitting in the museum space and talking about that, but I think it's a very strong question here in the archive, but it's also with, I think, ghostly matters, so like the idea of haunting is really like a call to action, or it's like something to be done also, no? It's the ghost that speaks to you, and you are really like, the idea is to do something about it, not just observe and say, okay, that's it, or as you were just saying. So maybe if I can have your thoughts about that, and yeah, it's kind of problem.
I think I'm a little gonna echo what I think I heard Anselm saying about what would be the ways to treat an exhibition like this as a scene of political education, and then I think we would have to, I mean, the approach would either be to accept the exhibition on its own terms. In other words, this is what is given to us, and then you make your way through it, and you take what you can within what is available to you, the amount of time you have, whether the hours of the museum you can make to view it, whether you can. I complained about the seating because it's very uncomfortable to sit on a chair without a back for an hour and watch a film. This is not really possible. So, you know, I mean, you can take it on its own terms and find a way through it, For those of you who haven't do it, I really suggest that you read the booklet first, because the booklet has a lot of information about what the films are about and where they are located, and then you can say, I have this much time, and I'm interested in this rather than that, and you can create your own route through it. I think I did that beforehand, and I found it very, very helpful. You know, I mean, otherwise we're going to start digging it up, and I don't know that we really want to do that, you know, in terms of just, like, yeah, what is this collection of things that are here, and what is here, because then the question of what's here and what isn't here gets raised, and that's a whole other, if you like, set of questions. And so, you know, anyway, I think it's to be enjoyed for what you have done the work to put it out and together for us, but maybe next time more comfortable chairs.
Yeah, I'd like to also not, you know, come to some like definite conclusions or judgment. I think it's really just because these things are so much like, you know, so uncertain right now. No? Like, I mean, it's almost cognitive dissonance. Like the media reality of the last, take just the last week, and then looking at these films. Like I wouldn't claim that I could bridge that cognitive dissonance. I can just try to listen to it and dwell in it. And then, yeah, there's this whole question, is the art space right now a meaningful place for political action? Or is not the very bourgeois contract, insofar as it's still active, of basically saying, oh yeah, here you are free as long as you sign in the small print without consequentiality, right? Like, so it becomes a merely, and that of course can also have a huge benefit, because then you deal with so-called aesthetic difference, but that is in knowledge, ideally, of course, of the contract that you've signed, right? Like that it's an aesthetic, a merely symbolic gesture, and not one of, say, how you build political movement or even messaging, right? So I'd love to have that full day here and just like with people who have seen all or most of it, and say like, let's try to make a think tank session, two hours of what is successful political messaging here, what is successful aesthetic strategies. On what register do we measure aesthetic strategies successful? For whom, right? I mean, just think. I mean, I'm not trying to, you know, make stupid suggestions also, like, but I don't know if you have been as affected by the Lego films as I have. This is insanely successful political messaging by some art school kids. Like, they're literally art school kids. I don't know if you read the portrait of the makers in the New Yorker. They made a quite beautiful investigative journalism piece on who made these Lego films. And they're pulling out, once a day, they're pulling out a new one. And they're basically winning the soft power game, right? So is this making a soft power claim? In a way, you could say this is the politicized art world that comes out of almost abandoning the soft power frame of the post-war liberal sort of MoMA documenta frame, right? And somehow the moment when this politicized art world really took over documenta, say in Documenta 15, it also collapsed. Right? Like, without going now into the details of why, no? Like, but there are questions been raised by what's the currency of on many different layers, no? And so whose subjectivity is it that can look at many different struggles? And what responsibility arises from that, right? Like, how do you actually connect different political struggles is a major question of, say, organizers. Like, union organizers from Latin America to meet people in the Philippines doing housework or domestic labor research with people in migrant laborers in China, etc. yeah, there is always a need for articulating things on an aesthetic level in order to produce a sense of communality, but also for political messaging. So this would be somehow the questions I have right now, right? Like, and I have serious doubts about, at least about prioritizing the art world as a meaningful place for political messaging right now. And I think everyone active in it really has to ask oneself this question. And I'm not making a call for abandoning it. I'm just saying we can't continue simply with the idea that by definition this is a progressive space that democratizes everything and makes everything more inclusive and rights the wrongs of the past, because that is just no longer, if it has ever been true, it's not true. But what we certainly can do is create historical consciousness and speak to one another about what constitutes it and how to deal with what socialized us, the foreclosures by which we are made as subjects in very different ways.
So that brings us back to our, not yours, but our original question about assemblage methodologies, because now you are talking about a different way of understanding assembly and assemblage. And then it is not only a question of political messaging, but a question of two other things. One are forms of solidarity and how those are built and maintained that are not merely social media hits. And also then forms of political organization that can leave the local level, where we have done a lot of really good work in building political organization at local scale and very bad at building political organization. Now you're going to get me on my story at these higher scales. And so what I think, the danger here is that people do not treat this media environment as a social media environment in which they can just click from one thing to the next and think that they understand, they know, they have a consciousness of proximity through consumption, as opposed to other forms of social relations and political relations that are even up to getting and dealing with the problems that Anselm has just raised around war, around the drift in the global system and where it is going, and how those global political economic relations will play out. The decline of Western privilege and hegemony, which is on its way, to get prepared for that, and so on. And so it's not to ask the artwork to do work it can't do. I think that's unfair, in a sense, like to ask it to do something it couldn't do. It's like, it's like asking a book to do things that a book can't do. It's more a matter of what you are doing in and around that, and what you do with it, and what you do with what you make of it, I think. And so in that sense, even if the exhibition provokes that question, that thought, that's good.
And I think that's also maybe to round that up, where I need to mention Raqs Media Collective, and they're like inhabiting of the archive with the Shamianas, the concept of Canopy for broken time. And I think in your seminar you're talking about assemblage, and for them the Canopy is really the place for togetherness and gathering, also against dispersal also. And I think that's maybe like one other aspect that was at least in this edition of the Disobedience Archive very important, to bring the individual works and very like the different stories together, but at the same time also to think about these the canopies, the moments to come together, to discuss, to fight and disagree and agree. So thank you very much. I think that's the moment to open for a few questions from our audience, because this talk is audio recorded. We will pass around the microphone.
Thanks for the talk. Avery, you were proposing to have another relationship to social movements, not by consuming them, so watching through a screen and going from one to another, but to have another relationship to those movements. And my question is, what do you propose? Like in the museum, like how could it be to, like, through which medium or through which, just through, what could be another way to have a relationship to the presented social movements within the museum, or should it be not in the museum but somewhere else to create another relationship to the fights?
I don't think the main relationship to the movements comes within the museum. The movements are not in the museum, they're outside of the museum, unless they are movements that address the museum. And there are a lot of those. And so if you're an artist, then you can step up to the movements that are trying to shut down the Guggenheim or do this or do that. I mean, there are movements within the art world by artists, by curators, by theater directors, by folks who work in that sector. And they have their own movements. And so if that's your zone, then participation would be one way to not treat it as just something you consume, but something that you either participate in or help to support in some way. So that's what I would say, Florence. It's not just that you find a way to connect to the movement. Once you're in here, that would be extremely difficult. Because also here there are hundreds of movements, if not more, that are referenced in these variety of films that are shown. So what is your standing in relationship to the movement also matters. Like, what's your investment? Why are you involved in the first place? You have to have a desire in that sense. Something is wrong and you want to fix it. You know, something is immoral and you want to denounce it. Something is working very badly and they're telling you it's the only way. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons that people get activated in that sense. It can be something very small, you know. I was for war, then my son died, now I have questions about it. That started a very important anti-war movement in the US by Iraq and Afghanistan veterans' families. So there is a point of entry and everybody enters in different places. So that's what I would say to that. No.
Thank you so much for the very inspiring talk and dialogue. I have one question regarding to Avery. I'm not so sure if I really understood how, when you at the beginning talk about archiving, but then you've been talking about Black Marxism. And it reminds me of this, coming from the very grassroots, like for people who doesn't really want to be governed and think about this fugitive planning. And I was even thinking, would that be, like, how would you image a way to even archive for those kind of group? And then maybe adding to that, another question would be, how do you translate this kind of methodology, so to say, into exhibition making? I guess Anselm already answered a little bit about it, but I guess also in a way that how do you museum or art institutions in general reach out to a broader grassroots public instead of bourgeois?
Okay, I will leave the second half about the exhibition making to the exhibition makers. The first question you asked, though, this to me is a very important question because it raises the important problem of what happens when people, groups, places, events, things, histories, etc., need to be kept secret. The whole point of fugitivity is that you are an outlaw. You know, it's not like a nice thing. It's like where you have to find a mode of existence individually, although never individually, always there's some kind of collective, whether it's organizing the run or whatever, that must keep you invisible. You cannot be found. So fugitives have to stay out of view, and many things that are fugitive in the more generic sense or the more general sense that you're referencing are things maybe that need to be secret. And so it's one of the things that I think our contemporary political discourse has difficulty with. The idea that actually stop talking about that. Or there are secrets, there are things that are not in fact to be exposed. Exposure is a problem, both because it exposes, but also because then it makes certain kinds of discussions and certain kinds of strategies difficult to develop. So I think you know what I'm talking about. So this is a big issue. So in the Hawthorne archive, the whole question of what's secret and what's not, the files that are missing, the things that nobody knows or they know but they won't say, this is a running motif throughout it. It's actually got a bit of humor in the book around this question of what's organized and what's disorganized and why no one keeps the files properly and why you can't find anything and where are the people who are supposed to be in charge of this and so on. I mean, it's tried to be given in a little bit of a light hand, but it is a huge issue because while it's really helpful for me to understand how, for example, runaway slaves in the Americas ran away. Like, what were the conditions of possibility for that literally? Like how people moved, where they moved, how that was possible, who forged the passes, who created the safe houses, who did all the things that made this possible as a route, a system, that sometimes people went long distances, sometimes they went hardly anywhere at all. They went next door. Anyway, just, it's really good for me to know that, and it's okay for me to learn that now. But it wouldn't have been okay for anyone to have exposed that then, when it was actually happening. And so in any event, the way we learn that history is through very attenuated ways. We learn that history by tracking posters for runaway slaves and how they were dressed and where they went and what people thought their routes might be. Police records, I mean, all the places where you go for the archive of fugitivity, that then it doesn't have the voices of the people you care about in it, so then you have this, how you would exhibit that in writing is you have to find some imaginative form for rendering it, while I think at the same time, you need to go beyond I only have a very complicated way of saying it, but the exhibition, in writing at least, involves somehow showing the traces of the history that made those people fugitive in the first place, while at the same time going beyond that so that they aren't just rendered again and again merely fugitives, but somehow subjects in their own right that we can never recover in any real sense. So to me, that's the representational problem. How you deal with that in an exhibition, I don't know.
Short
Sorry.
answer, I think.
Okay, short answer. How do you, okay, the last part of the question then, right? Like, how did you phrase it? Like, basically make it matter to communities. How do museums do that? Or that was your last part of your questions? Reach out. Yeah. I personally think right now that it's really about history. It's like how to create a common history and how to make that common history matter to people, right? Like because having a reference in a common history is very, very important for a sense of unlikely commonality and for a grammar of action. So I think what it's really, there's a lot of different things present here that could further be developed in that way. But in generally, you think that museums are insanely weak right now in even just updating their own historiographies to the state of the art. Like, you don't need to flag with great, like virtue signaling your progressive histories. You just have to translate the state of the art of historical research into the actual stories that museums tell, and we're far from that. It's absolutely, but you see how much that matters when Trump tries to ban a slavery exhibition in the Smithsonian, right? It matters a great deal. I would invest everything into building proper histories that are non-nationalized, non-sexuated, non-racialized. That's all what we have to do and what we can do.
I think that's a clear call to action. And I think I would leave it here. And it feels like we should go into that mode, the people behind us, or since a while. The bar is still open for a moment. We're going to open this door. Just a practical information or a request before we end. Please have your drinks here. Don't take them downstairs and in other parts of the exhibition. You're welcome also to leave from this door. And I say thank you. Thank you, Marius, Mario, Olga, for also everything around that evening. And thank you very much, Avery and Anselm, for being here and the conversation.
Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
having us, and all of you for listening.